Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Vanita. What I'm going to talk about is some experiences of the Indian Ocean World Archives and the uses from a perspective of an international climate initiative I lead called ACRE. And ACRE is short for Atmospheric Circulation Reconstructions over the Earth. Long mouthful there. But basically, it's based in the Met Office where I am. And as you'll see, it's near global, basically global in its coverage. And I'll try to focus more on the Indian Ocean aspects, of course, which is what we're on about today. It's what I might call an end-to-end entity, and that is in regards to the fact that it has sort of three components. The first part is it undertakes and facilitates the recovery, imaging, digitization, and curation of historical, instrumental, surface, terrestrial, and marine global weather observations. So it's a lot of data, a lot of information, and you can see from Antonia's talk, just for the Indian Ocean region, all the different ins and outs of material that's there, and you can imagine globally it's even more so. So that's one element of this end-to-end element. So a big data rescue effort, a weather data rescue. And this data is all made available to international repositories around the world that hold this. And that data is used to underpin or to be assimilated into three-dimensional weather reconstructions, dynamical weather reconstructions. There's a model, a numerical weather forecast model, put back in the past, if you like, and the data is fed into it and it's moved through in time so that you actually reconstruct the weather from an early date right through to near present. And these are called reanalyses. And I'll just put an example right at the end, if I get time, just showing a visualization of what comes out of all of this data. And we're trying to extend this coverage to globally for the last 200 to 250 years. So that's the second element of this end-to-end. So data through a reconstruction of the weather, to finally, the other end is climate applications and impacts worldwide, climate services or whatever. So data, feeding reanalyses or reconstructions to uses in that sort of sense. So let's have a look at some sources of, first of all, terrestrial data that exist. You've heard a lot of information from Antonia. So there's obviously a lot of data in the first bit there from Europe, some the original networks, some of the earliest networks that were there. But when we're looking at, say, at India and other places, like regions like that, then we're looking at old sources as well, but also looking at national Met services, meteorological services. So the Indian Met Department, which was formed in 1875, but some of them go back earlier. But the sort of things I really wanted to mention were when the possible sources under that broad banner, if you like, sort of looking at observatories, data from observatories, from medical sources, from military sources, missionaries even, consular records, lighthouses, port authorities, even general publications. You heard some of the information from Antonia, things like diaries, newspapers, pamphlets, journals, and government gazettes and learned society publications, from botanic gardens and even signal and pilot stations which are set up for shipping, etc. So there's just some examples of the sort of things that we have to delve into if we're to look back into the past, particularly before the national Met services were set up in the 1850s. So if we look at India, just as an example of a thing here, then we can see here just an example of a piece of information that we found, both in terms of data, that's instrumental data, and textual material, documentary material. And this was a cyclone which is said to have occurred in May 1787, and that's tended to be out of season somewhat, that part of the year. And so we had a trace on the top right that you'll see in blue, a trace of the pressure data for about 5 or 6 months in that year. And you can see there's a particular dip, low value in the trace there around about May. And what we wondered was, is this really a cyclone or not? I mean, can we quantify it a bit better or get some more information to try and see if it's true? And this is the sort of thing we need to do with any sort of records, or we try to do. The instrumental alone, and we can try and check that with all the ways one would do for that. But also it's good to have the documentary evidence to back it up. And so I put some of that information down in the panel on the bottom right-hand side. And you'll see there that in the period from 17th to the 21st of May, 1787, there is information from Madras and several other places, and that's Madras is the furthest red dot on left-hand bottom side for India, and the other places up along the Coromandel coast there. And it talks about high sea level, coast inundation, thousands drowned, no drinking water, hurricane inundation several miles, and destroyed a number of villages, etc. So in this case, we have some documentary evidence which helps us to sort of say, well, it looks very likely that this dip that we see in the pressure isn't just an error with the data, the instrument, but it is actually reflecting, in this case, this particular cyclone. So this is the sort of things we can do, bringing together more than just the instrumental data, but also marrying it together with documentary. I put this one in just for a bit of fun because it's a record for Calcutta from 1784 and 1785 by a fellow named Henry Trail. Says something about him there, and etc. What the data that covered pressure, the air, temperature, etc. And that's the trace. But the interesting thing was that I discovered that Henry Trail, you see on the far right side of there, the panel, you see a gentleman there, resided, that's not Henry Trail, he resided at the Alipur estate of my 4 times back great-grandfather, John Buller, above, and his brother Henry. So sometimes you actually find things that actually are related a little bit closely to one in the past. And it was interesting that, you know, this record was kept, we believe, at the same place, and that was owned by my 4 times back great-grandfather. So that's perhaps an interesting aside. So we can look at other sorts of records from other various people working in the Indian situation in the East India Company, etc. James Prinsep, who has many roles there, Secretary of the Asiatic Society, involved in the Assay Office, etc. And he recorded a series of data for, I've only published to put the pressure data here several times a day in the colour along the top on the top of the traces you see there. And that period from 1852 to 37. And you see I've highlighted with some red and a blue circle dips in the pressure. Now, are they errors? Are they erroneous data or something that we need to take account of? We couldn't sort of find any evidence from the instrumental record that that was the case. But we can bring in other instrumental records to sort of begin to sort of say, well, yay or nay. And so with this first red marked dip there in the pressure, we have some data from Chandernagore in the same period at the mouth of the River Ganges with a dip in the pressure around about this, was that 7th of May there. And you see the location of that in regards to point 2, which is where the actual Prinsep observations are made. And we also have some observations from a log of a ship, the London, and these are the plots in the Bay of Bengal. You'll see the London, just a couple of spots we had some pressure data from as a break in it, unfortunately. But again, that was showing a dip in the pressure around about the right time. So bringing together a lot of other evidence, instrumental data, as well as documentary data. And the same with the blue one, we found a little bit of evidence from an East India Company ship, the Duke of York, which was in the coastal area there around about the right time for this other event in May 1833. So this is the sort of thing that one can do in bringing together information. If you move forward further in time, then you can find some other information, and I think it probably was amongst the sort of material that Antonia talked about, held in the India office in the British Library. And these are what we call in the Met office the Indian Daily Weather Reports. Now, we heard that the Met Department there in India was formed in 1875. Well, by 1877, they were actually putting out, tabulating data from all their observational stations. And this set of reports goes right through to about 1980 when it becomes, when they stop putting the tabulations in. And I just put a diagram there that you can see for the period 1910 to 1930 within this lot of reports, just showing you the distribution of stations in that period. Most of it over the subcontinent of India, but you see observations in the present day, Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, some of them like in Muscat, in Oman, Aden, and even, of course, in Burma, now Myanmar, on the far to the right-hand side, to the east of India. So this information is very valuable. You sort of start off in the early years with maybe 40 or 50 stations, but by the time you get into the early parts of the 20th century, in this sort of period I'm just showing here, you can be up to a couple of hundred stations per day. Unfortunately, it's only once observation per day, but it's a very valuable data set. And to actually get this data together, this full coverage from 1877 to 1980, we had to not only get what we had in the Met Office archives, which wasn't a lot, surprisingly, but we also had to go to the National Archives of the United States. We had to go to the Met Service in Canada and the Met Service in France to get enough coverage to scan all of these books, or these volumes, to find that, you know, there were lots of missing ones. It took us quite a number of years to get this all together. And we just about finished scanning all of these. Oh, it's not to be scanned, but we just about finished digitizing this period up to at least to the 1950s or so. We probably won't go beyond that. So a very valuable resource. It just shows you, as time goes on, the amounts of data that can be available. So I mentioned, I was going to talk about not just terrestrial data, but marine sources of data. And then Tony referred to ship logbooks, and there are masses of ship logbooks, not just in the archives of the British Library or in the Met Office where I am, but other places all around the world. It's amazing where material is held. And they usually cover merchant shipping companies, naval data, and expeditions, and naval data from various countries, etc. So they're a valuable source of data. There are also things like ships' surgeons' journals, which we found, and they were particularly important on convict ships going out to Australia from the UK from about 18, well, the period that they cover that have been scanned go from about 1816 to about 1868, I think it is. And they've been very valuable. Sometimes there are wonderful tabulations that these surgeons have put of the data, all nicely produced at the end of the particular journal. Other times they're scattered amongst the writings for each day and amongst all the horrors of the medical remarks, as you can imagine, looking after people who are being transported out in pretty horrible conditions over many months. So it varies quite a bit, but they are very valuable data, and I'll show an example of that in a minute. There are also things called remarks books. These are what basically the hydrographic and naval surveys. They were done, certainly we've looked mainly at the Royal Navy ones, but a lot of other navies did these as well, because they're looking to see what the conditions, or map the conditions for the depth of the water, the currents, you know, water supply on land, et cetera, so that the ships can not only navigate successfully and find places to land, et cetera, but then set up camps and all this sort of stuff. So these are very valuable, and they can have quite in-depth data in them. There are also things like private diaries sometimes. So you hear that sort of, Antonio again mentioning that in the context of the British Library holdings, but there are other ones as well. And something that I found interesting was ship newspapers, or sort of newsletters, if you like. From about the 1860s or so, when you start to have regular shipping lines going from A to B around the world, you find that they actually sometimes had ship newspapers. And if you're lucky in the ship newspapers, they might have had people who actually went and extracted the data from the log for each day or series of days on the voyage. And if you get through, you can actually sometimes get the full voyage from this information, pulling it all together from what's in a newspaper covering a particular voyage out and around wherever it went. And so they're quite interesting and valuable sources of data. So this is just an example of the information we've been able to bring in from ACRE into one of the main international data repository for marine data. I won't go into it, just to say that that exists. And you'll see down the bottom here from 1770 to 2014, you'll see the blue bars are where the contributions from ACRE's efforts, probably up until about 2016, a few years ago now, when this was published. And you can see the blocks of data that have come in, amounts of data that are giving you this information in coverage over this part of the, coverage over the world. And you can see what's going on in the Indian Ocean. Obviously, we would like to have more, much more, but we're covering what we can. And you can see on the left-hand side the countries that a number of this material comes from. Now, obviously, a lot of it is British, Dutch, and French around about this period from the 1770s onwards. But there are many other nations that are contributing data and that are very valuable information can be gleaned from them. And we haven't finished looking through all of these, because a lot of them are still to be recovered and their sources properly scanned and digitized. But that just gives you an idea about a layer of information that we've been able to bring in from expeditions. You heard mentioned the East India Company. We had an effort back in 2007-8, with the British Library. We imaged the holdings of the East India Company logbooks. They were digitized by a program in the US, which unfortunately no longer exists. And so we came up with about 900 logs or so from this effort. And you can see on the bottom sort of left-hand side there, a map of the world, and particularly if it's obviously to the Indian Ocean from our interests in today. You can see the ship tracks with the creasing from blue to red, the amount of information that's been is available, and you can see the route then going through from the north through the South Atlantic, across the Indian Ocean to India and China, etc. So these are very valuable data, and these are the ones, what we're showing are the ones that actually, from our point of view, had instrumental data. There are a lot more which have other observations, including wind observations, and we're hoping to start in future, our colleagues who do this reconstruction of the weather I'll mention at the end, to look and see if we can actually absorb wind data, not just pressure data, into those type of efforts, which would be very valuable and extend things quite a bit. I mentioned I was going to show you a convict ship. This is the Albion in 1828, going from UK, England, out to Australia. And you can see the trace of it over the globe there with the red and the blue dots. The blue ones are actually counted according to their instrumental record, which is above that, they've had bad weather, storms, etc. And I've plotted above that a trace in sort of orange of the temperature data that was recorded on the ship by the ship surgeon, and in blue, the atmospheric pressure data. And you'll see there are a number of dips in the pressure, drops in the pressure. And what I've done there is actually taken the account as well from the surgeon's journal, not of just the instrumental observations, but when it talks about bad weather, really rough weather. And basically we can assign or ascribe a documentary comment to each of these drops in the pressure. So that gives us sort of beginning to give us confidence that we're actually recovering some useful information that eventually, when we quality control, etc., we could probably get it into these reconstructions, into the database that will allow us to reconstruct the weather. So I found 155 of these in that period, 1816 to 1868, or whatever it was, which had temperature observation of some sort. We don't know how good they'll be though. And about 50 odd had pressure, which is what the unit at the moment we're really particularly interested in, because we can absorb that into the reconstruction. So I just give you an idea of another source of data. The Indian Met Department, when they really got into full swing in the latter part of the 19th century, they did a particular effort on data from ship logbooks from 1893 to 1899, and that was again Sir John Elliott, was the second director of the Indian Met Department. He did this and was under his authority. And you can see the maps each of those years, the distribution of the ship data shown by the black dots and traces. You can see the main routes there across the northern Indian Ocean. So this is another layer of information. We keep layering information in from different sources. Some interesting things are that, of course, this is just raw data as it came off as it was recorded, that there's some data over land, which obviously means that the latitude and longitude in the books are not correct, or been just minus or plus signs have been missed or whatever. And so again, there's a lot of work in cleaning this up to be able to use this data. For some reason, they cut off at 10 South. I don't know what it was, but obviously a very useful data set. And again, shows you the ins and outs of this data. And the thing that we also need is, as the same for land data, is we need this, what we call metadata, that Antonio again alluded to, data about the instrument, about the ship, about the station, about the times and all this sort of stuff, that things were made. We need all this information to come up with the best quality controlled series of data that we get out of this, so make something useful out of it. We've also looked more recently into the 20th century. We've looked at Royal Navy logbooks. There's a dip in the data coverage from around about the First World War until the well, certainly in the First World War, but certainly also after 1923. So we've looked particularly at that period and recovered something like 7,000 or 8,000 ship logbooks with a citizen science project that says on the left there, old weather in the period from 2012, 10 to 2012. And we recovered as you see on the right-hand side there, the coverage of all this data. Again, the similar sorts of shipping routes as before, but this is a very important set of data. In fact, historians have been very interested because, of course, the onset of World War I at this time, and they can actually see changes in the ship tracks, etc. It reflects the sudden outbreak of war. And so it's more, it's a data set that can be useful not just for climate scientists, but for historians, geographers, political people, whatever. So that's an interesting sort of a little layer of information going in. Quickly, I'll get on to an example of somewhere we've been, took us 7 or 8 years to get this to fruition, and it started to happen, and we're actually looking at Mauritius and the Indian Ocean, because in Mauritius, there's a lot of interesting data there, and this Mauritius project, as we called it, is focusing on recovering a lot of the marine and the terrestrial data for the island data, if you like, for that part of the world. And so we're again looking at recovering, imaging, digitizing and archiving and preserving these old weather observations, mainly from the instrumental observations from various sources in Mauritius. And there are a whole lot of extracts from ship logbooks, 188 volumes between 1853 and 1914, which was set up by a guy named Charles Meldrum, who was one of the early secretaries of the Mauritius Meteorological Society. And what he did, and we don't know if he was the first one who did it or he was following other commands from the British hierarchy, but he sent his personal persons down to the harbour at Port Louis in Mauritius every day to try and get them to get on, ask the ship's captains if they could come onto the ships and transcribe the weather observations from the logs, and so then take them back to the Met service there and to develop this whole effort. So this was quite an interesting approach. It was done in several other places around the British Empire since subsequent to that. And so there's this a very vital sort of information. I'll show you an example of what this sort of looks like. There are also distinct ship logbooks from the actual ships in that period, 1848 to 1874, that we want to get at, and the terrestrial weather observations from Mauritius itself, somewhat from the late 18th century onwards. And so we want to try and build up a record for that place and anywhere else we can get from that. So it's a very valuable source of information in that southern Indian Ocean region, but also important for the wider Indian Ocean, as I'll show you in a moment. I mentioned it took 7 or 8 years to get this going. One of our colleagues at Brighton University went there in 2012 to the Met service. He found his photograph of some of the the data that's there, and curation sort of was a bit lacking. What we persevered and pushed the then Met director, and finally one of his people actually did up from 2014 when the second picture is taken, actually tried to clean up and at least parcel up and store these things in better condition. But it's still taken us up until now, another 6, 7 years to actually get permissions, etc., to digitize this data, scan and digitize this data. So very quickly, this is a picture of Colonel Lloyd, who set up one of the first observatory in Port Louis. There's a little diagram on the far right at the top, which is sort of a drawing of what it was like then. Now it's you can see a bit of it in the background there. It's a centre. There's a restaurant and a little bit of a centre there for on the dock there, and it's quite an upmarket enterprise. But there are still some vestiges of the old observatory inside that area there. A bit of information about Colonel Lloyd down there. So it's said to be the first meteorological observatory in the Indian Ocean. It's used to make cyclone warnings and to take astronomical observations. And the completely blurred and illegible one on the far right-hand panel at the bottom is actually a register of Lloyd's from 1833. You won't be able to read it at all, but I put it in there because this was published in a 1974, I think it was, publication of one of the anniversaries of the Met Society or the Met Office in Mauritius. And as I say, said to be Colonel Lloyd's the picture of his registry, but we cannot find that register. So we are still looking for that register. Those people who did it in 1977 are dead or whatever. And so we have to try and see where did that go to, where did it disappear to. This very quickly is this is a chart. This is one of Meldrum's efforts to try and put together just for one day. This is the Tuesday, the 1st of January, 1861. And you may not be able to see it that well, but there's some little arrows around all across the Indian Ocean, etc. And they are the ships. So they are the direction of the winds. And it's written, you won't be able to see that, but they are written the wind direction, the speed, and maybe even the pressure. And so this is putting the information he got onto charts. He was trying to do this. He didn't have enough money to do more than the first 3 months of 1861 like this. But we've got this massive data. You saw it in the earlier slide there that this was all drawn from, that we would like to get out and get digitized, etc. So you can see, and you might be able to see some little lines on there, little curved lines. he's attempting to draw isobars, lines of equal pressure, basically a synoptic weather map from this information. This is 1861. So you can see by the coverage there from Southern Africa right across to India, there's vital information why we want to get those 188 volumes excuse me, done. Just again, some quick things on the qualities and etc. of data. The top middle picture there is some material that was found University of Lisbon in Portugal. I kept pestering my colleague there some years ago because they thought they'd lost all of this in a fire in 1978. And they found it up in the attic in their building, stored up like this, some of it still singed, 200 meters of registers, etc., covering the period, I can't read it because my thing's been over, 1853 to 1978. And we're still trying to get some money for our Portuguese colleagues to collate this, scan, image, digitize, and curate it. So even in places in Europe now, it can be a difficulty in getting money to do this sort of thing. So again, I think that the bottom bit just really to sort of say, you want to store it safely, this old data, you want to scan it, image it if you can, and obviously digitize it and make it available for the wider community and the local spots. Daisy, sorry, go back in again. My second last slide is just to show you in 2019, this is the coverage of data that we scanned and digitized with the ACRE project. We have various regional foci for ACRE, one in Canada, Argentina, the British and Irish Isles, India, South Africa, etc. So these were the various efforts under the ACRE broad umbrella in these regions and over the oceans as well. And we managed to scan something like 107.5 million pages of information, of which only 21.25 million have been digitized. There's a log jam in getting it through the system. It comes in various forms, might be Excel sheets, might be anything, but we need to get it into common format. It might sound okay, but it's a big task, especially when you're fighting to get money to just to scan and digitize the data, let alone to be able to progress it through the system. So a lot of information is coming through. Whoops, there we go. So finally, yeah, we need to pull all this information together. And if I've got time, I will just show, I'll just stop sharing my screen on this and just show a video, if I can, of the, how do I do this? I don't need that. Share, so, am I going to be able to do this? Hold on. Right, let's try this. Okay, just please bear with me. Are you seeing anything now? No, probably not. Zoom, share screen. There we go. All right, nearly there. Okay, I presume people can see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I shall start this and say, this is a visualization from 1850 onwards. I'm not going to show it all, but what this is basically showing is what comes out of this reconstruction of the weather from the data that we're recovering. This is global, but it is an indication of what it looks like. So this is going from about 1850 onwards, and you can see as time goes on, more data, obviously, but we're trying to fill the gaps to make this, complete over the globe, and you'll see it improving as time goes on, particularly over the Northern Hemisphere first. You'll see some data over Southeast Asia, Australia, etc., coming in. The opaque, foggy-looking data is not real fog, it's the fog of ignorance. This is where our reconstruction, the model, is not able to deviate from climatology. We don't have enough data in it to actually get it to start to take into account what the data says was happening at the time. So it just falls back to climatology, mean conditions. So as my colleague who constructed this, Philip, says, he's in the fog clearing business. He's trying to get data to remove this sort of fog of ignorance. And so I hope you've just got an impression, an idea of what one's doing with this project in trying to get, okay, global weather, but for India, the sort of data that we will be able to improve the situation over the Indian Ocean. I better leave it there, I think. So thank you very much.